Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're going to make a really simple tool to bend some metal. This video was supposed to be an entirely different project, and in that project I needed to be able to bend metal reliably. And while talking about that project during a Google Hangout with my Patreon supporters, Evan from Evan and Caitlin recommended making a metal brake. So I looked around a little bit online, found several instructables and some videos on how people have done this, and I'm going to put together my own. But there's a bunch of different ways to do this, so I'm going to link some of the ones that I found down in the description so you have some more options. In fact, one of them doesn't even require welding. That may be interesting for a lot of you guys. All right, let's get to it. I only needed one piece of wood for this project, so I cut down a 2x4 to 4 feet and marked in a few inches from each end as a place to put the hinges. Before I start putting this together though, I kind of have to explain what needs to happen so you know why I'm doing these things. To use a metal brake, you have to have a flat surface that can bend and then a point that it bends over. We're going to start with a fixed piece right here, and that's where the metal's going to lay. The pivoting piece goes right up to it and has to be perfectly flat with it so that it can bend. Your sheet metal that you're going to bend lays on top of these two and then is held down with another piece, and this is the point that it's going to bend over. So essentially you have 3 pieces of metal that all kind of join in one corner. Your workpiece is going to go inside, and when you lift this one down here, it's going to fold the piece up. I'm telling you that because it really matters that these 2 pieces are at the same level, and we're going to have to modify some hinges to make that happen. Using the marks that I made earlier for the hinges, I figured out how long my 2 pieces of steel needed to be and then cut them on this metal cutting saw. As you can see, that kind of steel created a lot more sparks than the other kind, and with all the sawdust around, that made me really uncomfortable. Just a note, if you're going to be working in a place that has sawdust and metal where there's going to be sparks, make sure you have a fire extinguisher around. I'm going to go cut this other piece with a different saw. I clamped the piece down to my table and used a bandsaw to cut it off, and this creates 0 sparks, which is way better. It's really important that the center of the hinge, which is the pivot point, is right in line with this edge, because this piece needs to be right there as well so that they can bend right over where they're joined up. We're gonna make a small change to the hinge though before we put it on. When you're using a hinge for a door, you want them to be parallel. So usually you mortise into both of the pieces and connect them down so that the outside face of the door and the door frame are at the same level. But in this case, we want this one and the actual piece that's gonna be moving to be level, so we're gonna flip this piece around just by knocking out the pin. I flipped over one piece of the hinge and put the pin back in. That makes it so these are not on the same plane, but that's kind of what I need here. I want the angle brackets to be on the same plane. I marked where the hinge sets on my folding piece and then marked an area to cut out to make room for the barrel to fit in. To do this, I used a cutoff wheel on my grinder. I should have used my smaller grinder, but I didn't have any wheels to fit. This worked, but it wasn't terribly clean. If you don't have a big thing like this, you can also use a Dremel. I did a test with that just to make sure that it works with the small cutoff wheels. It does work, it takes longer, and you go through the wheels faster, but if that's what you got, you can use it. I line these pieces up with a spacer 2x4 and then set the hinge in place to make sure that everything lined up correctly. Then I lay down my top piece, which I'm going to bend over. Then I use the grinder again to cut out another section on this top piece so that the hinge had somewhere to go. I used some long wood screws to drive this into the 2x4 on both ends, then just used a Sharpie to mark the holes for the hinge onto the steel. I used a step bit to drill through these with the 2x4 behind it, and these went through very, very quickly. The step bit is good because you can start with a small hole and then get bigger as you need. I used some simple nuts and bolts to hold this together and made sure that everything moved freely. I laid my top piece in place and made a couple of marks where I wanted it to be bolted to the 2x4. At these places I used a file to start making a flat spot, and that's so that I could use a drill bit here. At a high point like this, the drill bit is going to want to wander from one side or the other, and so having a flat spot gives it a place to start drilling. And even holding it in a clamp with that flat spot, I still had a little bit of wandering. I also wanted a flat spot for the washer to sit, so I used a file to flatten out around the hole. I laid this piece back in place, used a Sharpie to transfer those holes to the piece below, and then used several drill bits to build up the right size hole. I didn't use the step bit here because I needed to be able to drill all the way down through the 2x4. I flipped it over and used a Forstner bit, and you could use a spade bit as well, to make a larger hole for the head of the bolt to fit in from underneath. I knocked these in place, flipped it over, and then put in some washers and nuts to lock these pieces together before putting on my top piece and then doing the same thing. I put on some washers and some wing nuts so I can easily tighten and loosen them from the top. The last thing was to add 2 handles to this tool. That's so that you have more leverage when you're trying to fold a piece of metal. I used a piece of steel tubing and cut down 2 sections of the same size. These fit over a solid steel rod that I had. To weld these pieces on the bottom of the folding piece of metal, I had to use a flap disc to clean off the surface, to get rid of all the paint and all the gunk so the welds would hold. I tacked them in place and then came back and did a full weld to really lock them together. A lot of the steel that I was using was reclaimed from another project, and it was covered in lots of old paint, so I had to grind all of that off and then spray paint all of my pieces into new colors. After that, I just reassembled everything with the nuts and bolts. I left extra space on the end of these 2x4s specifically so that I could clamp it to the table. This makes it temporary but also useful. Rather than masking them, I painted the entire rods and then just pushed them into the sockets, which tore off the unnecessary paint. I pushed it away and then these were ready to go. Using this tool is very simple. Getting what you want out of this tool takes a little bit of practice. Basically, loosen the wing nuts, slide in your piece of metal, tighten the nuts back down, and then lift the handles to bend it. And this thing packs away very easily as well. You just pull out the handles. I dropped on a couple of magnets, and that helps the handles to stick underneath it. Take off the clamps, and you can pack it away. The fact that this folds down into something this small and easy to move around is awesome. This is not a tool I'm going to use a whole lot, so I'll keep it stored away mostly, but when I need it, it's easy to pull out and set up. I just chose to make this 4 feet long because I had the material that was around the right length, but you could certainly make it smaller if that's all you needed. Making tools is a lot of fun, and you usually save a little money, not always, but in this case I think I did because a lot of the steel that I used was reclaimed from some old shelving units. If you have access to some old steel like that, this might be a really easy project for you to get started on, and like I said before, there are ways to do this without doing any welding at all. I'll link some of those other Instructables that I found down in the description. I hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. I've got lots and lots of other types of projects that you may be interested in, so check some of those out here, and don't forget to subscribe. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.